The kayak gives this incredible perspective on the world, where you are really embedded in the worlds of other species. You're surrounded by other animals. They don't respond to you in the way that they respond to humans on foot, because obviously they are so much more skilled in and on the water than you are.
This is the Listening Books podcast for every kind of reader, and especially for fans of audiobooks. I'm Jessica Stone, and because this summer lots of us are staying close to home, I wanted to bring some adventure, some voyage, some discovery to my reading and to the podcast. So today I offer you this conversation with David Gange, author of The Frayed Atlantic Edge, a historian's journey from Shetland to the Channel. Welcome, David, and thank you for being here. The Frayed Atlantic Edge is an account of the year you spent kayaking the Atlantic coastlines from Shetland to Cornwall. You're a historian, and I can't speak for everyone, but I know when I picture historians, I don't generally picture them in a kayak battling the elements. So can you tell me a little about how this project was conceived and how it came about?
Okay, great, thanks. So I think historians more and more these days are not kind of stuck in the archives that we usually associate with them, partly because those archives tend to record the stories of very particular people. So I think it's a kind of general trend that you'll see with the absolutely wonderful historian called Bathsheba Demuth, for instance, who's written a great book called Floating Coast about the Bering Strait, again, spending loads of time outdoors, talking to people, collecting those stories, oral histories rather than archival ones. So yeah, my approach to this came from kind of dissatisfaction with what stories are told in the archives. So what stories historians have traditionally told about Britain and Ireland, which tend to be very urban stories, focused on London in particular, but generally in big cities. So I was wondering what it would look like to think about those histories from the perspectives of the coasts, from the perspectives of people whose stories aren't usually recorded, rather than from the middle. So that's where the kind of impulse came from. But other than that, I used to do loads of my reading outdoors. I used to do loads of reading in mountains and on the coast, and that reading was never about the outdoors. And then gradually through doing that, began to kind of see the stories in the places I was going. And a couple of people, including the author Adam Nicholson, began to just push on me the idea that maybe the kayak would be a useful kind of tool for researching and writing, and maybe I should take advantage of the fact that I did that and stop reading books about cities on the coastline and start writing about the coastline itself too.
Why the kayak specifically?
Okay, so the kayak gives this incredible perspective on the world, where you are really embedded in the worlds of other species. You're surrounded by other animals. They don't respond to you in the way that they respond to humans on foot, because obviously they are so much more skilled in and on the water than you are. So you're kind of in their territory, and it gives you a really different sense of your role in the world, of your place in the world, and one that I think is actually really historical. Like the coastlines of the British Isles were kind of the main arteries of trade and transport. They were places that people lived much more than they do today. I mean, this is a country that really has turned its back on the sea in kind of practical ways. And most of the people out at sea in the past would have been in like tiny family boats, not in big ships or anything. So getting out in that little boat is a way of kind of finding connection to those pasts, to those not just pasts, but futures that we need as well. Futures where we don't think of ourselves as quite so separate, where we imagine ourselves to be part of the natural world rather than different from it. I love the kayak for that, just this kind of sense of connection to so much, this sense of kind of getting out of the way the city separates us from things.
What expectations did you have going into this, and how did those end up comparing with the reality?
So I remember waking up in kind of total cold sweats one night, just before setting off on the journey, realizing that I had signed a contract to do something that I had no idea whether I could do at all. I'd never taken on a kayak journey on this kind of scale at all, and I was sleeping outdoors in just a waterproof sleeping bag for most of the journey, and I had no idea how long I could do that kind of thing for either. And I was also going to some sea that is absolutely ferocious. I mean, starting from Shetland, where the sea is as wild as can be, that felt absolutely terrifying when I was setting off on it. But then I quite quickly felt extremely guilty because I told people what a challenge this was going to be. And then for the first couple of months, the weather was just perfect. It was as still as could be. And I felt like I was just in an armchair at sea. It was as flat as could be. And I told people, like, this is going to be such a challenge. And like my biggest threat, I think I say in the book at one point that my biggest threat for those first couple of months was like sunburned ears. So yeah, it was extremely fortunate. In a different year, I would have failed. I wouldn't have been able to do it at all. But for some reason that year, the kind of September gales didn't arrive till January, and it was just so much more straightforward than I could possibly have imagined it would be. And it just created that couple of months introduction to be able to get to grips with things, to be able to kind of build up some kayaking stamina, to get used to spending all that time outdoors before things did get more difficult over the winter.
Yeah, I was going to say that seems like a project you don't want to start in the winter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was really fortunate to have such pleasant conditions to start in. I deliberately made the first couple of legs of it quite short. So I spent a month over Shetland, which could have been kayaked in a few days if I'd have been pushing it. Making my kind of way as slowly as possible to really kind of absorb myself in the places. Then kind of round Skye in the winter, that was a really tricky part. It rained for nearly the whole month, and I was just constantly soaked through. That was a very, very, very different experience.
Yeah, are there any places that you went to that you definitely love to go back, but in a more welcoming season?
That's a really good question. So absolutely. I mean, and I guess so. I got to Ireland just as the spring was beginning, and I did the first few bits like round Donegal and down and across to Tory Island and things like that, when there were just kind of the first inklings of spring, and when the water was still really holding winter. That was quite an ordeal because I was having to launch through surf all the time and land in surf, which meant just quite a lot of bruises from falling out of the kayak when landing, things like that. And I would love to do that bit again in flatter seas, in seas that I wasn't having to worry about quite so often. It's like historically, it's such an interesting coastline, and places like Tory Island, which has historically had this most incredible independence. Like the islanders refused to pay tax for decade after decade. They were notorious for kind of fighting off tax collectors. Tax collectors would kind of come back to the mainland saying that they'd been kind of trussed up and thrown back in their boats, and talking about the kind of violent women of the island who'd sent them away. In the phrase from one of the reports, much less of a man than I had arrived. So, to spend a lot of time in places like Tory Island, socialising properly without the worry of what bruises were going to appear as I hit the water again, that will be wonderful.
This book contains so much. There is the adventure complete with danger as well. There's the history and geography. There's poetry. There's the natural world. There's stories and folklore. I suppose because I work in audiobook production, I have a natural interest in the spoken word and oral traditions. So I was wondering if you could say a little about what poetry and storytelling offer historians.
Poets are profoundly important on all of these coastlines, on all of these islands, for several different reasons. One of them is that the islands on the kind of west coast of Britain have often been seen kind of from the mainland as being kind of exotic or as being backwards. They've been given these kind of urban, kind of centered histories that really marginalised them. And historians have not been good at reclaiming that. They've not been good at pushing back against that. Poets have been wonderful at it. So, for instance, there's a poet called Christine Evans on Innocently, little island off the coast of Wales, Bardsey Island, who has kind of devoted her career since the 60s to kind of rewriting the kind of tropes that Bardsey is fitted into, to kind of giving it a different role in history, to kind of recreating the meaning it's given. So it's a place that used to be a site of pilgrimage. It's supposed to have like 20,000 saints buried there. So it's associated in the way that most people write about it with death. And she kind of really kind of reframes that and makes it a kind of living place of birth and of kind of real kind of natural life in ways that are absolutely wonderful, and in ways that kind of no historian has tried, or maybe no historian would try. And then there are poets in places like Shetland, like Roseanne Watt, whose work is absolutely glorious, came out just after this book was published, so it isn't included in it, but I wish it was, who do lots of this rereading, make these islands central, give them the kind of meanings that they've had for people who lived there, rather than the ones imposed on them from outside. There's a real sense in which the kind of histories written in archives, the official documents, tell stories that islanders don't recognise, and the poets who kind of are really the inheritors of long oral traditions. So languages like Gaelic in Scotland, or kind of Irish or Welsh, have much, much stronger oral, storytelling traditions than English tends to have. And the poets can kind of run back through those kind of oral histories in ways that it's kind of more problematic for historians to do in prose. So I always, when writing about these places, try and make sure that the voices of those poets speak, that I'm not kind of trampling over that with historical prose, but instead kind of providing some amplification for those absolutely astonishingly wonderful poets that occupy those islands.
That reminds me, you mentioned in the Western Isles section that Robert Macfarlane had received some pushback for the way that he had described those communities, more the tone, the sort of the lyricism, and that he had responded to that in later works by incorporating more voices from those communities. But basically, it made me wonder if you have, and you can set me straight if I've got that a bit muddled. Basically, I'm wondering if you've had any feedback from readers from the communities that you've described in this book.
Great, yeah. So first thing to say is I love Robert Macfarlane. I'm not being kind of snarky about his incredible body of work or anything like that. But yeah, the thing you're referring to, I think, is the kind of really, really wonderful kind of literary figure, poet and critic and everything else, non-fiction writer, Kathleen Jamie, who wrote a really powerful review back in 2008 in the London Review of Books, in which she kind of challenged Robert Macfarlane for his kind of first book about these kind of things called The Wild Places, for the way in which a lot of the difficult histories in these landscapes didn't appear, how he was kind of writing lyrically about beautiful places and ignoring some of the histories. And I think it's a really fantastic example of how a strongly worded but very insightful review can actually kind of improve a whole field. I think it's a huge credit to Robert Macfarlane that he, rather than responding to what was quite a critical review in a kind of defensive way, that he really, really developed his writing, enriched it in extraordinary ways for the later books. So I tell that as something that's supposed to be a kind of good story rather than one that's kind of critical of anyone at all, really.
Sure, yeah.
And in terms of the second part of your question, I'm sure there are people along the coastlines who don't recognise the picture that I give of the places that they live. It would be strange if there weren't. But I've been so happy with the response to the book from those coastlines. I most of the talks that I get booked to give are kind of along those coastlines in places. I was really pleased that the Highland Book Prize responded so well to the project, and the links that it's kind of allowed me to make with people up there who kind of do like the way that I've presented those things and kind of advocated for the voices from those coastlines. That to me has been the thing I've enjoyed most about the whole process, really. Mm-hmm. There was one writer from Shetland who did ask me whether my whole method for writing is waiting in coffee shops or bars to ambush locals and learn about the places. That was after I'd ambushed him in a coffee shop.
That's lovely. I mean, that seems like a good strategy to me.
It's certainly a fun one.
You mentioned this earlier, but one of the striking observations that you made in the book is how our current understanding of place and our perceived connection or lack thereof to other places has been shaped by the dominance of cities in the interior, and how fundamentally our understanding may be altered when the focus shifts to the coastline. You did touch on this earlier, but I wondered if you could say a little more about that and what connections these coastlines reveal that might surprise us.
The journey was kind of calculated to be both quite obvious. It was simple. It was just following those coastlines, but also to really kind of defamiliarize. So it was all the way down Britain and Ireland, but the first 7 months of it were all in Scotland, and only 1 month of it touched on England, the very, very last one. And I'd travelled for, I think, 5 months by the time I reached the second town with more than 6,000 people in it. So it was really like travelling for a long time without any sense that cities existed. The coasts I was travelling along were not kind of port towns and beaches. So I think I'd been travelling for many months longer than that before I reached the first beach that you might like buy an ice cream at. So a very, very different kind of perspective in that sense, and also linguistically as well. So a really extraordinary proportion of the whole journey was spent on coasts where English isn't a kind of really dominant first language, where the other languages are really significant. And those languages give us really, really different perspectives on the world too. Like if you're thinking about the stories that we tell about different bits of history, like a big concept like the Enlightenment, for instance, that moment that for cities was this real kind of flourishing, but that I would think of as being quite a violent moment of cities beginning to dominate other places and taking kind of from other places. Like the Scottish coastlines, for instance, the west coast of Scotland had its Enlightenment far earlier, and the years that we think of as the Enlightenment were totally disastrous for those coastlines because the cities tried to incorporate them into kind of this new political economy, this new kind of way of doing agriculture, which led to the potato famine in Ireland being far worse than it should have been, and led to the clearances in Scotland. So the Enlightenment was a dark age for the coasts. Just as the 70s were a kind of economic downturn for the cities, but a real moment of revitalization on the coastline. So often the stories are opposite. And I would like us to find ways of being able to tell British and Irish history without telling these stories that only work for cities and that still kind of continue to marginalize those coastlines in the way that they have been for so long. They really have, through so many periods of our histories, been the center of the islands that we live on. And they're so outward looking, so connected to other places, whether that be kind of other Celtic places like Brittany, or whether it be kind of the whole North Atlantic world. I mean, Shetland has so many connections to Denmark and Germany, as well as to Scandinavia and to Iceland and Faroe. So they're profoundly outward-looking and cosmopolitan, but just really different geographical links than we usually associate Britain with having.
I can't help but note that the year that you did this journey in 2016 was also the year that the UK decided to leave the European Union. And that strikes me as something which, again, we think of maybe from an understanding based on the dominance of cities rather than coastlines, maybe. I don't know. But I'm wondering if that felt more or less removed for you while you were doing this journey.
So that vote happened, I guess, about a month before I set off. So I set off in July 2016 and kayaked to July 2017. It was the sense of Britain trying to decide what direction it was going to go in was really quite palpable during that journey. So a lot of the communities that I was traveling through, communities where fishing is a really important industry, a lot of those fishing communities did vote for Brexit and were kind of really debating at that point whether this was going to be a good thing or not. There were some who were quite optimistic about that, and others who felt that this was going to be a total disaster for the areas. We've seen how fishing has been treated over the last few months in those terms. So it would be very, very interesting to go back now and see how the tone of those debates has changed. There was a real sense of those coastlines reconsidering what their futures might be in the light of what had happened. Of course, for most of Scotland, most of those coastal regions of Scotland, the vote was really predominantly to remain, and there was a kind of real sense of betrayal at the same time. So we'll see what happens with these coastlines. The thing I was trying to get towards is the way in which the EU over the last kind of 30 years or so had been working to kind of reintegrate these kind of coastal areas in some way. One of the 7 EU cultural zones that they identified was the Atlantic Arc, and lots of projects were put together through that to bring like Galicia and Wales and Gaelic-speaking Scotland together, and that has produced some things that I think have been quite exciting, and it would be interesting to see where those kinds of projects go now that we are kind of severed from that Atlantic Arc in practical terms.
If I could ask you to speculate a little, do you think that this tension between what's good for coastlines and what the sort of mainland decides is best for itself, are those always destined to be in tension, or can decisions be made that benefit both?
I think so. There are ways in which organizational changes have worked for the benefit of coastlines over the last kind of 30, 40 years. Ways in which kind of local councils have been reorganized in ways that bring decision making to the coastlines. Like, that sounds like a kind of boring, mundane kind of thing, but it can actually be profoundly important for allowing some kind of self-determination on those coastlines. I would love to see a kind of increasing localization of decision-making. Personally, I think that the nation is the kind of most problematic organizational unit of all. I think working in kind of international terms or in very kind of local or regional terms tends to operate quite well, and the nation tends to kind of often be really problematic as this kind of middle kind of size structure. I'd just love to see the coastlines be given more kind of power in that kind of decision making. I'd love to see more resources being put into the languages of the coastlines as well. They're under real threat at the moment, despite the revitalization of the last few years, and they contain kind of so many riches of kind of perspectives on the world that we kind of desperately need as we kind of come more and more to terms with how damaging the kind of mainstream culture that we've pursued for the last century actually is.
You're listening to a conversation with David Gange, author of The Frayed Atlantic Edge, here on the Listening Books podcast. Now feels like a good time to mention that David has a website that offers a lot of wonderful supplementary material to the book, including resources for language learning if you're inspired to take up one or more of the Atlantic languages highlighted there. The website is frayedatlanticedge.wordpress.com. I will, of course, link to it in the show notes. There's also some stunning photography from his journey, and some of those include encounters with wildlife, which is what we're going to hear about next. If you're enjoying the podcast, there's a few things you can do beyond listening, if you like. You can follow or subscribe to make sure you always get the next episode. You can share a link with people you think would enjoy it. You can write a review on whatever platform you use. And you can engage with us on social media at Listening Books. We always love to hear from you. You mentioned earlier, the benefit of the kayak in being, relatively unobtrusive and quiet, and how much closer wildlife is willing to get to you like that. So I wondered if you could just share some of the more memorable encounters with wildlife that you had.
That's a lovely question, and thanks for saying nice things about the photography, which it doesn't really deserve. But so yeah, the kayak is just the best wildlife hide you could possibly imagine. So a few of the things that really struck me wildlife-wise that I will remember forever. One of them, the first one, was kind of setting out from the very, very beginning of the journey, heading up north from the very north of Shetland up to the rock that is the northernmost part of the British Isles, a little rock just called Outstack, which is right next to Muckleflugger, which is a huge gannet colony. So heading out and thinking, I wonder if this is going to feel kind of ceremonial and like a dramatic kind of start. And within kind of a few minutes of leaving Shetland behind, was just absolutely kind of surrounded by thousands of gannets, just kind of in a big, huge circle overhead, this big kind of vortex of gannets. They weren't squawking or anything, they weren't vocalizing, but still the kind of sound of their wings was immense. So just this immense sound of gannets overhead, to the point where I couldn't hear the sea anymore at all. And just,
wow.
The scale of life involved in that, with great skewers coming along and trying to pluck them out of the air as well. Just so dramatic, so unusual, and just such a kind of beautiful moment for setting off, to feel that I had this kind of vast orchestrated accompaniment. Really, really quite something. Then one thing I love to do, so I have a little kind of, they're not goggles, but it's like a mask. So not a full snorkeling mask, but a mask that allows you to see at 360 degrees. So I have that with me. And if something really exciting comes along, then I will put that on and tip myself up so that I can see it in the water. And doing that with basking sharks, if basking sharks approach, is just one of my favourite things ever. I love basking sharks a lot. But another really memorable one that was almost disastrous was kind of sitting in the kayak watching minke whales. So I was sitting watching them come up and kind of learning a little bit about the patterns. So they'd come up like once, and then they'd go down for another 5 seconds or so, and then come up kind of 30, 40 feet further onwards, and then go down for another 5 seconds or so, or 10 seconds. And then they do that kind of 3 or 4 times and then disappear for a while. And I suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, caught sight of one come up about the distance behind me that meant I should expect it to 5 or 10 seconds later come up right underneath the kayak. So I held onto my paddle very carefully with one hand, making sure I could brace, and got the camera out with the other, and kind of held the camera up, and it came up about kind of 10 feet to my right, and I got this incredible view of this. It was almost like because there was quite a bit of swell, so it was almost like the side of the wave was kind of museum glass, and this kind of whale's eye and throat pleats coming out, and I got my one photo just before it kind of went down again, and my whole kayak, just by the water at this place, just kind of shifting sideways, just about managed to stop the camera going to the bottom of the sea, and kind of start paddling on, and got the photo. And so that's one of my favourite photos I've ever taken, just because the moment of it and the fear of whether I was actually going to be able to stay upright through that was such a dramatic one.
That's amazing. You've got to have that framed in your home somewhere, right?
I haven't, but I probably should at some point. And then just the other little rarities you sometimes see. So I love little auks. So little auks are like cousins of the puffin, but about the size of a sparrow.
Oh.
They are really tiny, and they spend a whole year just on the wing out over the ocean. Obviously, there's these huge kind of stormy seas, and you've got these tiny little kind of seafaring cousins of the puffin out. And every so often, especially after bad weather, a handful of them might kind of turn up on different bits of the coastline.
I'd like to ask you about the audiobook now. Ed Hughes narrates the audiobook, and I was just wondering, did you have much input in the casting and production of it?
Not really. He asked me for some advice on some pronunciations and things, and I was given a choice of from 4 people.
Oh, okay.
To begin with, to read it. So Ed was the one I chose from those 4. I just got a brief snippet of each of their voices.
Yeah. Were you ever tempted to do the narration yourself?
Yes. Yeah. I there are many ways in which I would have loved to. I was advised that that when authors try and do audiobooks themselves, they the sight of them coming out of the studio can often be quite a dramatic one, of like the people who look like they've been through quite some kind of ordeal, especially for people not used to doing that kind of thing. That there is a benefit to having a professional do that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it is true that it's a test of endurance in many ways to read an audiobook, especially if you're not used to it. And I think especially if you've been out in the open air and enjoying yourself in a kayak, then to suddenly be in a very small dark room while you're for hours on end to read aloud, that does seem like it would be challenging. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, because I saw on your website that there are some other projects in the works. Would you like to say anything about what you're working on now? Yeah,
so this is a book that is, because of the pandemic, is taking a fair bit longer than was originally planned. But the next book is called Afloat, and it's kind of casting off the kayak and instead taking kind of traditional boats, so wooden boats and skin boats, and it's taking a much bigger geography as well. So including Faroe and Greenland and Newfoundland, and then down to the Caribbean to finish, looking at the stories that can be told through the kind of small boat traditions of those places. So at the moment, I'm reading lots and lots of First Nations and other Indigenous perspectives on boats and the kind of significance of boats to those kind of cultures, which in some ways are incredibly different from the histories that I've written about them so far, but in other ways have quite a lot of parallels in terms of places that are kind of bigger, kind of commercialized culture has kind of dramatically trampled and kind of taken kind of center stage over, where there are many perspectives from those kind of small boat kind of communities all around the North Atlantic that I think are really, really worth recovering. So I've taken 10 individual small boat styles and have taken journeys. Well, in fact, I was going to say I've taken journeys so far in some of them, but in fact only in one of them so far. So starting in Ireland with a boat type called the Bordomra, which is now entirely extinct, but that it was possible to find a boat that was going to become a sailboat called a puchan, where if it didn't have a sail in it, it would be essentially a Bordomra, and kind of use that to kind of explore the kind of ways of life that the Bordomra had made possible in some kind of small parts of Connemara. So yeah, again, journeys. There's a lot more kind of discussion with people who make and use boats in this book. There's a lot more kind of portrait photography and things too, and a much more kind of black and white aesthetic rather than the kind of full colour of the Frayed Atlantic Edge with its bright yellow kayak. So yeah, it's a wonderful project to be doing. It's just one that it hasn't been possible to do all the planned travel for. I was supposed to be spending the whole of 2020 travelling to places like Greenland, which has obviously been delayed.
Gee, I wonder what happened that could possibly have thrown off those plans. I want to shift gears now and ask you for some reading recommendations for listeners who might be attempting our 2021 audiobook listening challenge. One of the challenges is simply to listen to a non-fiction book that is not a memoir. And you reference so many wonderful books in the Frayed Atlantic Edge that I figured you'd be a great one to ask for recommendations for this category.
Okay, great. I'm having a think. So the book that I mentioned right at the beginning, if you want a kind of really kind of significant historical kind of rereading of a place that is full of other species, full of really kind of sensitive understandings of different cultures, then Bathsheba Demuth's Floating Coast, it really is the place to go. It is wonderful. A book that I think everyone kind of would benefit from some kind of engagement with. Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. I know it's very popular at the moment, so lots of your listeners might already have it on their lists, but it is really wonderful. I'd also can I make a suggestion for poetry too. I don't know if it's available in a kind of full audiobook form, but most of the poems from it are available to listen to, or even as kind of film poems too. Roseanne Watt's Mother Die is such a glorious book that, again, I think can really help anyone kind of understand those kind of coastlines that are kind of so close to us. Rebecca Giggs's book called Fathoms, which is about whales, is also absolutely brilliant. There are some great books about whales out there, whales with an H, I mean.
Wonderful. Thank you for those recommendations. You know that Listening Books is a lending service for people who, for reasons of disability or mental health reasons, or for a variety of reasons, find it difficult to read traditional printed books. And when I first asked you about doing this conversation, you mentioned that there was a link between this project and disability. And I just wondered if that's something that you would like to talk about and share.
Yeah, so the person who the book is dedicated to, who was my partner for 20 years, who was the person who got me into so many of the things to do with the book. So she's first language Welsh speaker. So that's kind of where my interest in small languages comes from. But back in 2009, so I didn't grow up kayaking at all or really doing anything to do with the sea. But then back in 2009, she had a car accident, a kind of really life-changing car accident. So we used to do lots in the mountains together until then. But since then, she's not really been able to walk for more than like 5, maybe 10 minutes a day. And yeah, her mobility has been kind of drastically reduced by that accident. And yeah, it was shortly after that that we thought maybe boats are the way for us to still do lots of outdoors things, even though we can't kind of get in the mountains anymore. So we bought our first little inflatable 2-person kayak, and we took it on some incredibly stupid journeys, some ones that I can't quite believe we did. Like one of our first trips was to Bardsey Island across some of the most dangerous tides imaginable, and it was terrifying, but we got the bug. We both absolutely loved it. So yeah, since then the kayak has been kind of her way of doing lots of outdoors things still. She is now a Paralympic kind of hopeful kayaker. She's part of the kind of team for those kinds of events. She's currently the reserve for the World Championships coming up. And yeah, I now obviously spend lots of my career writing about kayaking. So it was a very kind of fateful decision. But yeah, one thing that I've learned through kind of engagement with the kind of Paracanoe team and things is just how amazing boats are for people with limited mobility. Just the kind of freedom that a kayak can give to some people with those kind of conditions. So yeah, it's been quite an incredible journey.
That's really an inspiring story, and I thank you for sharing that with us. I think a lot of our listeners will appreciate hearing that.
Great.
And thanks to David as well for all those enticing book recommendations. I'll put this in the show notes along with all the usual links. If you want the book equivalent of feeling the salt spray of the Atlantic on your face this summer, The Frayed Atlantic Edge is for you. I'll be back next month. In the meantime, we'd love to hear how you're finding adventure in your reading this summer. So come find us on social media @ListeningBooks. We'd love to hear from you. The Listening Books podcast is produced by Listening Books, a UK charity that provides an audiobook lending service for over 115,000 members who find that an illness, mental health, physical or learning disability affects their ability to read the printed word or hold a book. It's simple to join. For more information, head to our website www.listening-books.org.uk.